Um, anyway, so today I'll get, I'll definitely finish civil rights and get into the 60s and the anti-war movement, which I think is of great interest. We were talking about civil rights last time, and like I said, I think this is the most successful of these movements in the sense of actually transforming conditions for African Americans in the United States. You go from slavery to Jim Crow to um, legal equality in this process. It occurs over a long period of time. It involves this kind of concentrated, organized effort by various groups. Yesterday, I think we finished with the Birmingham March, and then in response to that, John Kennedy announces a Birmingham boycott. I'm sorry. And in response to that, John Kennedy announces that he's going to try to get Congress to pass a civil rights bill that's going to deal with public accommodations. And the day after that, in fact, the field agent for the NAACP in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, was shot dead and killed. Shot dead, of course. I played Mississippi Goddamn, right, the Nina Simone song, didn't I? I didn't. Oh, I thought I did. No, I guess. Well, no, they would know. Let me do that. I thought I did. I feel bad now. I already take care of that. Mississippi is a very unique place. It's probably the most, and this is quite a title, but it's probably the most virulent and violent of the southern states. Mississippi is where Emmett Till was killed. Mississippi is where Medgar Evers is killed. We're going to talk about Freedom Summer in Mississippi. To the north, Mississippi kind of signaled, the absolute horrors of the South, and there's a lot of good stuff about it. Nina Simone, anybody familiar with her in here? Nina Simone is amazing. She died about 5-6 years ago. Jazz, blues singer, very political, often referred to as a race woman, very active in civil rights. And this is just an amazing song, especially considering she wrote this in somewhere in the mid-'60s, I guess. And it's really, one of these cases, like I said before, where you can learn more in this 4 or 5 minute song than you would in a long lecture about this particular topic. So this is Nina Simone singing about the South in particular, and especially Mississippi.
Tennessee make me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi gone down. Alabama's got me so upset. California's make me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi gone down. Mississippi, I know you can feel it. It's all in the air. I can't stand this pressure much longer. Somebody save me. Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee's made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi gone down. You gotta feel me. My love's on my plate. School children sitting in jail. Black hat across my back. I think every day is gonna be my last. Lord have mercy on this land of mine. We all gonna get it in due time. I don't belong here. I don't belong there. not even fucking breath. Don't tell me, I tell you, be my people just about me. I've been there, so I know. They keep on saying go slow. Not when they say go slow. Not when they say go slow. That's much the trouble. The windows in the car. When nothing was on. Too damn lazy. I think it's crazy. Where am I going? What am I doing? I don't know. I don't know. You better stand up, be found with all the rest. Everybody knows about this. And we all there. Picket lines, school boycotts. They try to say it's a communist plot. But all I want is equality in my system, my brother, my people, and me. My people and me. You lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk me down just like a lady. You stopped calling me Sister Sadie. Look, my country's full of lies. We all gonna die in our lives. I don't trust nobody anymore. You don't say go slow. Yeah, that's what they say. So slow. Well, that's just the trouble. Desegregation, mass participation, unification, things gradually, the people gradually. I don't know, you have to be next to me, to skip the line, politics. Everybody knows about this, everybody knows about Alabama, everybody knows about Mississippi.
Nina Simone was active, and many celebrities were, like I was saying yesterday, it's kind of like the politics of today where you have celebrities involved in things. Civil rights really brought out people like that, like I said, Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Charlton Heston actually was active in the civil rights movement, supporting King and people like that. And of course, then you had people like Harry Belafonte, who was deeply involved in it, Nina Simone, and a lot of others. In response to all of this, the African American community galvanized. They're obviously quite happy that Kennedy has proposed the civil rights bill, but it's not getting anywhere. Southerners in the Congress, like I said yesterday, filibustering it. They're just kind of hoping it'll die. So King and others decide to organize pressure against the political establishment to get this bill passed. And the culmination of that occurs in August, the last Saturday in August of 1963, when over 300,000 people go to Washington, D.C. for the famous March on Washington, and there's footage of it there you ought to check out. At the March on Washington, King delivers what we talked about yesterday, his most famous speech, I Have a Dream speech. I also have some video up there, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez sing. There's a Dylan song which you ought to listen to. It's called Only a Pawn in Their Games. This is about Medgar Evers as well. And Dylan, just like Nina Simone, kind of encapsulates this in a really concise and neat way. But what Only a Pawn in Their Game is about is essentially how white Southerners are being used by the same power structure that's oppressing blacks. And one of the best lines is, the South politician preaches to the poor white man, you got more than the blacks, don't complain. You're better than him, you were born with white skin, they explain. And the point there is that Southern whites don't have any material benefits either. So they're told to oppress blacks as a way to kind of, increase their own status and esteem. And that's kind of part of that whole kind of Southern system. But the March on Washington, in terms of public relations, is a huge success. King's speech galvanized the world. The following year, 1964, King actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize. In terms of the legislation, though, it doesn't really do much. It's still kind of stalled. Far more important with the Civil Rights Law is Kennedy's assassination. Succeeding him, which terrifies African Americans at first, is a Southerner, Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who's the first Southerner to be president, since before the Civil War. Johnson did not have a good record on civil rights. Johnson was a crude and vulgar man in a lot of ways. Johnson often used the word nigger. Nobody expected much out of him. He surprised everybody. He made a priority out of getting this civil rights law passed, and using kind of Kennedy's death as a catalyst for it. There was this kind of national mourning period, and kind of Kennedy became almost canonized. So Johnson is actually able to get this thing moving. At the same time, like I said before, there's pressure in the streets as well, and this is the more radical part of the movement. It's occurring at one level with people like King and others who are actually putting pressure on Congress. The March on Washington, the point of that was basically political. Let's put pressure on Congress. At the same time, you have these street level activists as well, especially in SNCC. And like I said, SNCC is probably the most important group in this entire era of any kind, certainly in civil rights. SNCC, which had organized the Freedom Rides, in 1964 decides to go into the belly of the beast, Mississippi. And they organized something called Freedom Summer. There's there's a couple things here on Freedom Summer which you ought to check out. Freedom Summer was directed at Mississippi because Mississippi was, I think, the only majority black state at the time. I believe Mississippi had a little over 50% African American population. Yet in the previous election, I don't know, 1960 probably, something like 6% of Mississippi blacks were even registered to vote. So what SNCC wants to do is go into Mississippi and register blacks to vote, right? Now, there are a lot of problems, a lot of barriers to this. The states and Congress had passed a constitutional amendment outlawing things like poll taxes, because before that, you'd have to actually pay to register to vote, which obviously worked against poor people and especially African Americans. There were literacy tests where you'd have to kind of go in and write an essay or something like that, which was very difficult for people who weren't educated. And these work against poor whites as well. I mean, essentially, the power structure doesn't want poor people voting. And then, but more than anything else, it was simply intimidation and fear against African Americans and throughout the South, especially Mississippi. So, and there were also kind of, you have to register on this particular date. You have to register in Jackson, which is the state capital, between the hours of 12 and 2, and you go there and then out the lunch sign is up, that kind of thing. So SNCC decides to kind of attack this problem frontally. So young people train, and then they move down to Mississippi. Now SNCC is still a mixed group. It's African American and white, both. But SNCC is coming to a boil, and this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem within that organization as well. But in Freedom Summer, you have both African American and white students go down to Mississippi. This is kind of another action, but it becomes a huge national story when 3 young men go missing, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. I can't remember their first names, obviously. Jim Goodman is a black student from Mississippi. I'm sorry, Cheney's a black student from Mississippi, and Schwerner and Goodman are Jewish college students from New York, all right? Blacks in Mississippi, you've listened to Nina Simone's song, they've always been, marked, and they've always been at risk. These 2 kids from New York, though, that's different. And so the media takes notice and really follows the story in ways that it probably wouldn't have otherwise. And SNCC is presenting a very radical analysis, yet the kind of human element of these 3 missing kids overtakes that. They're eventually found dead in a swamp in Mississippi. And this kind of, again, crystallizes the country. It's this, kind of gives impetus to do something. no matter what kind of, the paradigm I often use is, you all familiar with All in the Family? That show, you ever see that? Well, Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker, in the show is this kind of goofy, racist, obnoxious guy who supports Richard Nixon. Archie Bunker was kind of a mix of what ethnic Democrats had become. In 1964, the Archie Bunkers of the North probably supported civil rights. Why wouldn't they? It's appalling what's happening in the South. Kids are getting attacked. People are being kidnapped and, getting killed in swamps and things like that. So the Schwerner Cheney Goodman story really resonates to a lot of people in North. Something's got to be done. No matter what kind of a racist you are, this is just, what kind of racial attitudes you have, this is just over the line where, people are actually getting killed for simply trying to vote or simply trying to register people to vote. At the same time, Mississippi blacks issue a challenge to the Democrats as well. Right? Now remember, the Democratic Party is the party of the South. And so what blacks do is they actually create their own delegation, and they go to the national convention, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So again, they're in the streets, but they're also taking this political angle as well. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Freedom Party featured a woman who really is one of the icons of the civil rights movement. She was the mother of, 17 kids or something like that, huge family. She'd been raised as a sharecropper, and she was spoke at the Democratic National Convention. The point for the MFDP was to replace the regular Democratic Party's delegates to the convention. Lyndon Johnson, even though he will eventually come around, rejects that, and he seats this white racist delegation. But the woman is Fannie Lou Hamer, who gives a very impassioned speech, which again really kind of galvanizes the people involved. I just play part of it.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer.
It's 1964. They're wrong about the date.
And I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Louisville, Mississippi. Sunshine County, the home of Senator James O. Eastman and Senator Kennedy. It was the 31st of August of 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Illinois to try to register to become first-class citizens. We were met in Illinois by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literature test at the time. After we had taken off to see what was happening, and somebody screamed from the car that the fire workers was in and said, "Get that one there." And when I went to get in the car, when the man told me I was under arrest, he kicked me. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Missy Vesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So I said, she said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her, I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came from my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrolman. He asked me where I was from. And I told him Louisville. He said, "We're going to check this." And they left my cell and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, "You were from Louisville, all right," and he used the curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you were dead." I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The State Highway Patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the State Highway Patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. When I laid on my face, the first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat him till he was exhausted, the State Highway Patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat and I began to work my feet. And the State Highway Patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream and one white man got up and began to beat me in the head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled the dress, I pulled the dress down and he pulled the dress back up. I was in jail when Matthew Ellis was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to speak with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Given all the events of that year in 1964, Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act, and this is the signing and the statement if you want to take a look at it. What's the Civil Rights Act do? It's actually dismantles legal apartheid. It says that no longer can you discriminate in public accommodations based on race. What are public accommodations? Anything that is available to the public. Buses, restaurants, schools. It gets rid of the legal system of segregation, the legal system of apartheid. It's a huge victory. It's something that African Americans have been working for centuries. It's along with what will happen next year, the major achievement of that movement. for the mainstream civil rights movement, this is what they've been working for, and it was kind of a stunning victory, especially considering Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner, had engineered it. All right. That doesn't mean that the situation in the South has improved dramatically. The oppression, the violence continues, and in fact, the following year, you have another one of the kind of signal events in spring of 1965. King and others planned a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, again to protest the segregated system in the South. Right after this group of blacks, and this was the Sunday before Easter, and become known as Bloody Sunday, not long after the African Americans and others took off, they were met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by state troopers. And let me see if this just has the first, I just want to check a few seconds of it to see if it shows that.
Of towns and cities. In New York's Harlem, more than 15,000, half of them white, filed somberly through the streets in quiet but agonized protest. The events in Selma had been brought to a climax by a nighttime attack on a white Boston minister by white men. He died 2 days later. Many feeling he suffered martyrdom in the cause of civil rights and voting discrimination. The next day, 4 men were held for his murder. For the Reverend James J. Reed, that illustrators write his epitaph with this tribute. Selma sprang overnight from an obscure southern town to the front pages of world newspapers. This church was headquarters in the Negro drive for the right to vote, and it was here that Martin Luther King came to lend his support to the campaign.
I'm here to tell you tonight that the businessmen, the mayor of this city, the police commissioner of this city, and everybody in the white power structure of this city must take a responsibility for everything that Jim Clark does in this city. It's time for us to say to these men that if you don't do something about it, we will have no alternative but to engage in broader and more drastic forms of civil disobedience in order to bring the attention of the nation to this whole issue in Selma, Alabama. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician from governors on down who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam and cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking the right to vote. Continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse. Go home or go to your church. This march will not continue. Is that clear to you? We have no alternative but to keep moving with determination. We've gone too far now.
Oops. Keep in mind too, this isn't, you know, you're kind of used nowadays to seeing scenes like that because we have cell phone cameras and stuff like that. This was done, you know, this wasn't some kind of guerrilla, you know, filming. When you see scenes like that, or when you see scenes from, you know, Birmingham with Bull Connors, people attacking the school kids, the cameras are in plain view. And so the people doing this know they're being taped. You know, these guys know there are cameras there, and so it's of no concern really to them. That's just kind of accepted that that's okay. This is what, you know, this is what you do in the South. The Selma to Montgomery March and the crisis of Bloody Sunday motivates Johnson to go before the country, and I think the talk is down there. And he announces the next step in the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act. What's really quite amazing is that at the end of his televised speech, he uses the phrase, "We shall overcome," which really kind of stuns Black Americans. It's the kind of the famous anthem of the Civil Rights Movement, "We shall overcome." So he sends the Voting Rights Act to Congress, and the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are the major successes. This is the apex of the movement. Civil Rights Act dealt with, like I said, public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act kind of federalizes the election process in the South. It says that in southern states, blacks, you know, obviously are kept from the polls. So the government's going to send representatives to the South, federal agents, who will basically take control of the registration and voting process. They'll make sure that blacks are allowed to register to vote. Marshals will be there to make sure that the voting is done in a legal manner, and that blacks are not intimidated and kept from the polls. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are dismantle, like I said, the legal system of apartheid. Blacks can now vote, register and vote, take buses, take public accommodations, go to schools. So the vision that the movement had about 10 years earlier than that has met with success. It's a tremendous triumph. And at this point, you know, King, like I said, he's won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's an internationally known, you know, man of peace. The movement could have kind of sat on its laurels, but it didn't. And the great triumphs of 1964 and 1965, in retrospect, really do mark the success of the movement. What happens after that is kind of inevitable too for movements like this. Now, like I said before, it's kind of difficult to say, you know, blacks get the right to vote and they can go on the bus and go to school, and that's radical. Keep in context the American South. This is a region that had slavery, Jim Crow laws. You heard Fannie Lou Hamer's story. That was fairly commonplace. I mean, Fannie Lou Hamer's was incredibly graphic and difficult to listen to. That happened in the South. She wasn't the only person to be attacked like that. You know, from Emmett Till and all these stories we know about, and for everyone you know about, there were a lot you didn't know about. The South was an incredibly violent area. So the resistance of whites to these measures, you know, kind of indicates just how entrenched that region was. And so to have the federal government step in and say, we will guarantee the rights of African Americans to go to schools, to vote, to ride buses, any of that kind of thing is really fairly monumental. And to Southerners, it was considered radical. You know, the line in Nina Simone's song, you know, they call me a communist. I mean, that was basically the main line. In fact, even Kennedy and LBJ had concerns about King. You know, the Kennedys had J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, follow King around. They were, you know, conducting surveillance on him, recording his phone conversations. Martin Luther King liked women, including other women beyond his wife, and the FBI had evidence of this, and they threatened to release it. They actually sent a letter to King saying, you know, if we release all this information about your extramarital affairs, it's going to devastate the movement. They're going to lose faith in you, and they suggested he kill himself. So, and this is Kennedy. These are the great liberals. I mean, keep in mind, Kennedy has a kind of an iconographic status in civil rights lore, but in fact, he was forced to do everything. Kennedy went slowly. He didn't act until he saw these horrors in Mississippi and Alabama and elsewhere, and he finally announces the Civil Rights Act, which is still pending when he dies. And Johnson, kind of, they're both, kind of talking this, there's communist influence. They don't want to lose the South. Legend has it that when the Civil Rights Act passed, Johnson said, "I've just given the Republican Party the South." And it's true that not long after that, you start to see the Republicans take over the South. In my survey course, when I teach about this, I'll play Sweet Home Alabama and point out that no one would have written that song 10 years earlier. Ain't nobody would have, proudly said, "I'm from Alabama," and that kind of thing. So it really is this resurgent South, which emerges out of this kind of retrenchment. And so out of success comes, on one hand, a more radical critique by African Americans, but then a backlash against blacks from white America, from liberal America. Liberals made civil rights possible up to 1964, 1965. And I've said this before, reiterate, liberalism and radicalism are something quite different. Don't listen to the Tea Party and all that. I'm not talking about ideologically. Their history's bad. And I mean, Democrats are the same. Liberals and radicals are very, very different. When we get to the New Left, that'll really become clear. I mean, liberals in many ways are the biggest reason radicals don't do more, all right? They provide kind of a barrier, a buffer zone to the system. White liberals, the Archie Bunkers of the world, had been in favor of civil rights because to them it was just kind of an absurd issue, right? How can you not let people vote? Why would you kill and beat people up for the color of their skin, right? In addition to that, though, there's no sacrifice. If I'm a northern white guy in Ohio or New York or wherever, letting blacks in Mississippi vote or letting blacks in North Carolina sit in at a lunch counter doesn't affect me, doesn't hurt me. I don't, doesn't require any effort on my part, right? When the movement goes beyond that, you're going to start to see this backlash. So the period after the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act is really one of this incredible level of success, but also radicalism and backlash. For a lot of blacks, the radicalism stems from the frustration, and this becomes a national movement too. The civil rights movement up to 1965 was a Southern movement. After 1965, it becomes both an African American movement and a class movement, and that's really important. All right. To a large measure, it's because a lot of blacks, who generally admire King, even more listen to people like Malcolm X. And you probably know the Malcolm X story. I don't want to go into it in too much detail here. You should read the autobiography of Malcolm X if you haven't. His father was, he claimed his father was killed by Klansmen. That story, I don't know if it's been corroborated. He spent time in prison. He worked as a porter on the trains where he became buddies with Red Fox, the comedian, actually. He spent time in prison, and in prison he converted to Islam, which is not unusual. And he becomes, after that, a leader in the American Muslim movement with Elijah Muhammad. It's Malcolm, as much as anybody, who is responsible for the conversion of the famous boxer Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali, one of the great boxers of all times, an incredible political activist in his own right. Malcolm X is from Detroit, and he speaks to the rage of more urban and northern blacks who aren't really, they can vote, they're allowed to go to restaurants and things like that. Their rage comes from kind of their class situation as much as anything. It's racial and class at the same time. There's an inadequacy of jobs and housing. There's clearly discrimination and repression. You don't have the kind of Mississippi level of violence there, but there's this just kind of daily fear, daily repression. You're confined to certain neighborhoods, you're confined to certain jobs and things like that. And there's a lot of stuff by Malcolm. These are some of his more famous speeches, which you ought to take a look at. A lot of, especially younger blacks, are really taken in by Malcolm X. Because Malcolm, what's King's major tactic for the movement? Nonviolence, right? He speaks about that a great length. Civil disobedience, active militant nonviolence, but nonviolence nonetheless. Malcolm X said, Martin Luther King tells blacks to let white people beat on him, and he gets a Nobel Peace Prize for it. So he could be very caustic toward the movement early on. Malcolm is probably most famous. There was a big poster that was all over the place in the 60s, Malcolm X holding a gun that said, "By any means necessary." All right? Now keep in mind too, because there's this dichotomy here, and a lot of, especially young blacks, looked at King as I said before, almost like an Uncle Tom. Martin Luther King was in jail several times. Martin Luther King was beaten. Martin Luther King was stabbed. Martin Luther King was eventually assassinated by white racists or who knows who else. Malcolm X wasn't. Malcolm X's rhetoric was far more assertive and far more militant than King's ever was. But in fact, King actually suffered from the system more than Malcolm did. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 by other black Muslims. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories about that. It seemed, yeah.
Well, why was Malcolm X seen more as a threat than Martin Luther King? Because he was the one that wanted to go out and actually do violence.
Yeah, except that, well, I mean, he was considered a great threat. At the same time, even in the black community, Malcolm X did not have a majority support. I mean, most blacks distanced themselves from Malcolm. Martin Luther King had widespread support in both the black community and the white community. Now, up to 1965, King is considered safe, right? Now, what you're going to see after that, which we're going to get to in a minute, is that King becomes a great threat too. But I'm not suggesting Malcolm isn't. I mean, a lot of people, what Malcolm X often said that, and there was an interview with Ossie Davis, actor who did a lot of work with them, who said that one of the things they would say is, when King and others talked to politicians, they would say, if you don't deal with us, you're going to have to deal with Malcolm X and his people, and we're a lot more reasonable than him. And that's another thing. There's this kind of theory, and I'm not sure how applicable it is, that far left radical movements push things out further, so that the mainstream movements or the liberal movements, and I would consider civil rights, on one hand, like I said, within the Constitution itself, it's very radical, but it's essentially a liberal movement. It's asking for legislative redress, right? Laws, or court decisions or laws. But one theory is that radical movements, by making demands which are beyond that, force the people in power to address liberal issues more seriously, because the alternative, right? And my point isn't that the people in charge weren't afraid of Malcolm. I think they were. Clearly, the American people were scared the hell out of him, But at the same time, I think actually when you look at what King did, his life and what he actually did is very militant. I mean, I think, I'm not kind of dismissing Malcolm so much as I'm saying, it's too easy to dismiss Martin Luther King. I think it's this kind of liberal reformist when in fact there's a lot more to him than that. King considered himself a socialist. Malcolm X did. The Nation of Islam was actually a very capitalist organization. I mean, King thought that the basic ideas of socialism were pretty solid, right? Malcolm, however, resonates because of the kind of the rhetoric and the strategy. We need to defend ourselves, by any means. And the idea that all blacks are kind of involved in nonviolent civil disobedience isn't true either. I mean, you had in Louisiana there was a group called the Deacons for Defense and Justice. These were black men who armed themselves, and I mean that's what scares the government more than anything else. Black guys with guns who are willing to defend their rights. So I mean, the movement wasn't always nonviolent. You have these other elements of it, but by and large, liberals are willing to support King for that. I probably won't play it, but King gives this incredible speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, and he says, he gets attacked because he's opposed to the war in Vietnam. And he says, "You loved us when we said to be nonviolent toward Bull Connor. You loved us when we said to be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. But when we say to be nonviolent toward little Vietnamese children, all of a sudden you don't love us anymore," right? So I mean, King, by this idea of nonviolence, is not threatening, right? This is kind of almost, and this is why a lot of young blacks would refer to him as an Uncle Tom, right? I mean, King understood. I mean, there were conversations he had with people where he was as angry as anybody. Read the letter from a Birmingham jail, which I need to put up here. I mean, he's angry. He's really angry. At the same time, he's confiding to people. Look, we can't fight. We can't get violent because they'll destroy us. Bloodbath. Because white America, the first time African Americans assert themselves that way, white America's going to run away. They're not going to support him anymore, and he knows that. So, I mean, this is really kind of the dynamic. And after 1965, this becomes really the problem with the movement. Not a problem, I mean, it's just a barrier with the movement because essentially, in 1965, King says, well, we're not done yet. There's a lot more work to be done. White America basically thinks that the problem's over, kind of like it did after the Civil War, right? Well, we fought a Civil War, slavery's over, right? Which is why you have this kind of, aborted effort to do anything like, the Freedmen's Bureau or whatever. Well, the same thing's kind of going on in 1965, right? So on one hand, you have Malcolm X On the other hand, you have these young people, not on the other hand, it's the same hand, on one hand, on the other hand, yeah. The young people are becoming more militant as well. SNCC kicks out whites. SNCC becomes an all-black organization, and it undergoes a metamorphosis into the Black Panther Party. In Alabama, a group of SNCC activists got together and they decided to run for office. And as the symbol for their political party, they chose a Black Panther, a flag with a Black Panther, and they became the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panthers scared the hell out of white America. Eventually, the Black Panthers moved to Oakland, which will become their political base. If you're following the Occupy movement at all, Oakland today is probably one of the more militant, probably the most militant of all the Occupy movements, and it's been that way for a long time. Oakland is a predominantly black city. The Black Panthers set up base there. Now, the Black Panthers did a lot of things, all right? And they have this public outlaw image. At the same time, the Black Panthers set up school lunch programs, Black history programs. They had their own ambulance because quite often, you know, if you called the white ambulance, a black person would die in the streets before the white ambulance showed up. They had their own ambulance service. So on one hand, it really is this kind of like civic organization, this almost self-help organization. The Black Panthers also kind of like maintain this imagery of protest. One of the most famous pictures is one of the Black Panther leaders, Huey Newton, who's sitting on a big rattan chair with a spear and you know, bandoliers and things like that, right? The Black Panthers would march in public carrying guns and have, you know, ammunition, right? It's kind of ironic. The strongest gun control law in the country was passed in California by Governor Ronald Reagan, who, you know, was a gun nut for the most part. Why? Because blacks were carrying guns. Political blacks were carrying guns, so it scared the hell out of people. The Black Panthers really push this issue out. The Black Panthers not only have this kind of political imagery, but it also kind of ushers in this era of black nationalism, where African Americans have become more separatist. Like I said, SNCC kicks out whites. This is when you see colleges start to develop things like Black history programs at the under pressure from black activists. Some blacks begin to kind of, this is when you see a lot of blacks will convert to Islam or maybe change their names, wear dashikis, things like that. There's this kind of cultural nationalism as well. It also invokes this incredible backlash. There's a lot of stuff here that you might want to look at. Rap Brown is one of the Panthers leaders. Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael in this speech talks about black power. This becomes kind of the symbol of the movement, black power. The basic point here is that, you know, up to 1965, blacks are asking for rights that everybody else has, right? Let us vote, let us ride buses, right? Everybody else already has that. Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers saying, now we need power. We don't simply need to get these rights, we need power. Every other group that comes into America does that. The Irish took over Boston, the Italians took over certain places, the Poles in Chicago. So we need to assert ourselves with power, all right? And this is frightening. Now this is really where the backlash kicks in. You have assertive black men. They're not playing the role of King. King always wore a suit. King always spoke politely, although King was very militant. He was nonviolent. Now, again, this idea of King, I mean, you know, don't just judge King by what young blacks think of him. Judge him by what the South thinks about him. He's the most hated man in America. Southerners despise Martin Luther King. They think he's a communist. They think he's a terrorist, right? So his nonviolence, which may seem weak to some in the South, is an incredible and great threat. And this is, and I'm not trying to dismiss the Black Panthers, which I think served a vital role. I mean, you know, basically after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, where are you going to go? Do you say, okay, the problem is over, it's fixed, or do you keep moving on? And the Black Panther Party and others, building off of what Malcolm X and others had talked about, begin moving on and putting pressure and taking what they think is the next step. The problem is America isn't ready for that next step. White America, liberal America isn't ready for that next step. Now, one of the ironies here is that King is actually kind of moving in the same direction. And there's a lot of kind of, you know, what ifs about King and Malcolm X, because Malcolm X in 1964 had gone to Mecca, where he said he sat across the table from people who had shiny blue eyes and light skin, and realized they had a lot in common. He also runs afoul of the Nation of Islam. After Kennedy was killed in 1963, Malcolm X was the spokesman, and he issued that famous statement, "The chickens have come home to roost," meaning that Kennedy was a man of violence. He had tolerated violence in the South, in Vietnam, and so that violence had come back and taken him as a victim. Elijah Muhammad gets rid of Malcolm because of that. There were also personal stuff going on within the Nation of Islam, which made Malcolm kind of an outcast. The kind of internal politics of the nation as well. So Malcolm X at that point becomes kind of a freelancer. He wants to create an organization for Pan-African unity. He wants to get black peoples from all over the world together, and he wants to go to the United Nations and talk about the situation in the South, not as a civil rights issue, but as a human rights issue. He wants to go to the United Nations and put the United States on trial, essentially, for human rights violations, not unlike what's happened in South Africa, in his mind. Blacks in the South, like I said, it's an apartheid system. Martin Luther King, after 1965, begins to move in this direction as well. He understands that Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act are crucial, but there are other problems. And King begins to look at the problem of class. Blacks can vote, blacks can ride buses, go to schools, but does that solve the problems of lack of jobs, low wages, poor housing, lack of health care, that kind of stuff? So King begins to make this transition from a race leader to a national leader and a class leader, dealing with class issues. And the kind of culmination of that comes when he announces in 1967 that he is going to have a poor people's campaign. Now, no longer is King simply dealing with African Americans in the South, he's dealing with poor people all over, right? King is going to talk to dirt poor white farmers in Appalachia. He's going to talk to migrant farm workers in the Valley, Native Americans in New Mexico, black workers, black industrial workers. He's going to go all over the country talking to poor people, right? This is kind of what the populists tried to do in the early days, right? This movement that takes poverty and class as its basis rather than race, right? At the same time, this is a movement that's going to still be identified as a black movement. Blacks disproportionately have fewer jobs, the unemployment rate among blacks is higher, make less money. So this is where you start to see the turn, where the Archie Bunkers, the northern white workers, begin to get alienated from Martin Luther King. When King was saying you should be allowed to vote in Mississippi, no sacrifice, of course they should. Of course blacks should be allowed to vote in Mississippi. Now, if King is saying we want better jobs, we want housing, we want better wages, what's going to happen in the mind of a northern worker? Not without reason. What's he thinking? What is this going to mean now? I mean, it didn't require me to do anything to let blacks vote in the South. I just had to support Martin Luther King, right? I didn't have to do anything. But if you're going to really create better jobs and better wages and housing and health care for blacks, what's that going to require? Money. What kind of money? Right? And where's that come from? Where's the federal government get its money? Taxes. Right? So am I still on board? I'm not so happy anymore, am I? Now you're asking me to sacrifice. All right? See, this was, for most whites, this was a Southern problem. For blacks, Malcolm X said, when I think of the South, when somebody mentions the American South, I think of everything below Canada, right? But for most Americans, it's a Southern problem. Now that people like King and others are saying, no, it's a national problem. Whites don't want to hear that. So this is really when the backlash kicks in. As part of that, on April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King gives what I think is his most powerful speech here. And it's real long, so I'm not going to play it, but you have to listen to it. He gives a speech on the Vietnam War. It's called A Time to Break the Silence. And it's really quite powerful. He goes to the Riverside Baptist Church, and this is where he says, we have this ugly specter in Vietnam of young black men and young white men fighting and dying together. to preserve rights for the Vietnamese that they themselves, these black kids, don't even get themselves, and or they couldn't even sit at the same table in New York or in Georgia, right? So, and then he calls the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. This alienates the white liberals at this point, run away from Martin Luther King. The Poor People's Campaign and the speech on Vietnam really discredit him in the eyes of white liberals. There was a Richard Goodwin, who was one of LBJ's aides, at one point when King and others are organizing the Poor People's March, says that the Negro is sullen and ungrateful. And this is a phrase used all the time, ungrateful. After all we've done for them, this is what we get in return. We allowed them to vote. We allowed them to go on the buses. And look now what they're doing. They're organizing a Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign was aimed at Democrats and liberals. They're basically saying, you haven't done enough, right? There's a great song by Stevie Wonder called You Haven't Done Nothing. We are amazed but not amused by all the things you say that you'll do. And it's essentially a rap on liberals. You know, you talk a good game, but at the end of the day, what have you done? You know, to King and others, voting rights and civil rights was crucial, right? But that was the first step. That was a step toward a larger goal. And that also served the interest of the white ruling class because it opens up the South for investment, for commerce, to create a bigger consumer base, right? Now, when King and others are suggesting that you move beyond that, it becomes pretty hairy. And the Poor People's Campaign is kind of King's last hurrah. It's not, the organization isn't going well. Traditional allies are running away from him now. It's harder to raise funds. You know, when he needed money for the civil rights movement, 1962, 1963, he could call up Harry Belafonte. They would have a fundraising party in you know, somewhere in Manhattan, and he would walk out of there with tens of thousands of dollars. You're not getting that now. You know, you're not going to get Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett and people like that to fund what they consider, or what most people would consider, some kind of socialist, radical, or redistributionist plan. Just think, Obama's, you know, these people call Obama a socialist for I don't know what reason. I mean, can you imagine, you know, what King was getting called at the time, right? And that's the thing to keep in mind. King has this larger analysis of class and the American political economy. It's not just blacks in the South are being oppressed. And King and Malcolm X are quite different that way. Their personal backgrounds are different. You know, like I said, Malcolm spent time in prison. He comes from a poor family, lived in Detroit. King comes from the first family, one of the first families of black America. His father was well known. He grew up in relative affluence. He had a PhD. He went to good schools. Went to Emory and then Boston University for his PhD, right? So there are tremendous differences, but there's this kind of convergence too by the late 1960s where you know, Malcolm X is starting to see that this is bigger than just simply a race issue, and so is Martin Luther King, right? And the Poor People's Campaign is the result of that. It's not going well, and in fact, in April of 1968, King goes to Memphis, Tennessee, where garbage workers are on strike. Black garbage workers, you know, had a different set of work rules. So King goes to Memphis. There's just not a good vibe going on in the movement at that time. On April 3rd, 1968, King speaks at a church in Memphis where he gives. There are three kind of speeches that really stand out with Martin Luther King. Obviously, I Have a Dream, the March on Washington, the anti-Vietnam speech, A Time to Break the Silence, which is much less known, and then, of course, the speech he gives on April 3rd, 1968, where he essentially, you know, kind of eerily kind of prophesizes his own death. You know, I've been to the mountaintop. I'd like to live a long life, but, you know, I may not get there with you. And in fact, the next day in Memphis, King is murdered. At that point, that unleashes one of the most intense series of uprisings in U.S. history. America kind of blows. Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Cleveland, massive damage, hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage. People are killed. There's a real sense of loss and alienation. So much of the movement had revolved around Martin Luther King. really since 1955 and 1956, that without him, there was no kind of grounding. We haven't talked much about the kind of role of individuals in movements, and like I said, King is one of the people I do talk about. In general, you know, I don't like to deal with this kind of what they call the great man theory of history. Most movements have forces and structures beyond people, but at the same time, you can't deny that Martin Luther King was incredibly important, vitally important, one of the real movers in this. I mean, he is, to the civil rights movement in America, he would be, you know, comparable to somebody like Ho Chi Minh to the Vietnamese Revolution, which is something I study. So King's death really kind of, in a sense, you know, ends things. It's kind of a bookend. If you want to start with maybe Brown v. Board or something like that, you would bookend it with King's death, because at that point, there's such a sense of desolation and despair. The Black Panthers continue, but the backlash is in full force now. And what you see in 1968, there's a presidential campaign, and Richard Nixon runs against the legacy of civil rights and the legacy of the 60s. He says, I'm going to restore law and order. Now, when white Americans hear, we're going to restore law and order, what do they hear? It's kind of, you go through the white person translating machine, you know, and it's like did you ever see Snoop Dogg has the shizzlator on the internet? But you go through that translation machine. When Nixon says, I'm going to restore law and order, what are white people hearing?
You're going to take back the civil rights.
Well, not necessarily reverse. We're going to put them in their place, right? They've gone too far. You're not going to reverse voting rights and civil rights, but this stuff's got to stop. And in fact, in Nixon's ad, when he's talking about law and order, one of the images will be like the Black Panthers marching through, you know, California. And I mean, you know, they were dressed in all black. They wore black berets. They carried guns. It was really quite a spectacle, quite a scene. It terrified white people, scared the hell out of them. This is kind of Nat Turner, right? I mean, if you want to kind of, you know, play it that way, I mean, this is kind of the images of Nat Turner, and King was much like Frederick Douglass, right? So, and white America doesn't want to deal with that. They want their black leaders to be, you know, comfortable. They want to feel comfortable with them, right? Remember, what did Ann Coulter say a few months ago? Our blacks are better than the Democrats' blacks, right? You want to feel comfortable, which is why, you know, in the 1980s, Jesse Jackson was reviled by a lot of people. He didn't make people feel comfortable, right? And so, and King gets to the point where he no longer makes people feel comfortable. When he turns against Vietnam, Johnson is furious and livid. Lyndon Johnson is just furious because, you know, and like I said, they're ungrateful. We've done all this stuff for them, and he turns on the war, right? So there's this real sense of alienation in the black community. Marvin Gaye, who wasn't a political singer, wrote a beautiful song about what was happening in that era. He went to Motown. You know, Marvin Gaye had a contract with Motown. Motown is famous for kind of dance music, or, you know, kind of happy music. You know, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, beautiful stuff, incredible music. And so Marvin Gaye wrote this very reflective album, and he brings it to Berry Gordy, who doesn't want to release it. He said, we can't do this. This is too controversial. Marvin Gaye stood his ground, and it came out as one of the most, you know, probably I think the best thing Motown ever put out. But I want to play like kind of the lead song from it. It's kind of indicative of what's happening.
1, 2, 3, 4. Mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, there's far too many of you dying. You know you got to try to bring some loving. Yes, Father, Mother, we don't need you yesterday. Oh, no, Peter, go on in love and Papa. You know got to fight to bring some loving. Kick inside, punishment, but brutality. Talk to me, what is do you can think? Oh, what's going on? What's going on? Hey, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. Woo! People, you know, we got to find a way to bring some understanding. Yeah, yes, to get down, get inside. But don't mind this thing, but brutality. Don't believe, you can see what's going on, what's going on. Hey, what's going on? Wanna know what's going on? Oh.
By 1968, the long-term dream of civil rights is fading. Ironically, in the 70s, what you have in many ways is kind of the aftershocks of the success. In the 1970s, you see significant numbers compared to the past of African Americans being elected to office. In 1967, the first two black mayors in big cities were elected, Carl Stokes in Cleveland and Richard Hatcher in Gary, Indiana. In the 70s, you start to see African Americans, because of redistricting and other issues, get elected to office. You start to see kind of the emergence of more kind of cultural nationalism, black history programs, but you also see a backlash. Probably the best example of that occurred in Boston, a northern city, which Boston can match most southern cities. Next time you're watching a Celtics game, you could probably count the number of blacks in what used to be the Boston Garden, the Fleet Center. The Boston Red Sox actually were the last team, I think, in the major leagues to have a black player. So Boston is a tough city, and the courts in Boston had ordered forced busing to desegregate the schools, since Boston schools were as segregated as many southern schools were. So they were literally picking kids up and bringing them to schools outside their neighborhood in order to create a desegregated school system. The Boston busing riots were as ugly as the South in the 60s. So there really is a backlash, and even today, it would be ridiculous to deny the changes brought by the Civil Rights Movement. What it's done is create an African American middle class, create educational opportunities. At the same time, clearly the unemployment rate, basic rates of social welfare, incarceration are still much higher among the poor, and the black are disproportionately poor in the United States. So the movement was limited after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, right? The movement itself, given many of its goals, achieved great success. It did so, using tactics that were not radical. They weren't throwing bombs. They weren't organizing, violent protest or anything like that. It was essentially using tactics that would, King was influenced by Gandhi, that would try to kind of force the country to realize what it was doing was wrong. And remember when Scott was here talking about the environmental movement, one of the things you want to do is force people into this kind of dilemma at the point of action. What are we going to do? In places like Birmingham, the firemen just turned their water hoses off. They couldn't do it anymore. They could no longer attack these 10-year-old kids, right? That's not typical. That's not typical. What happened to Fannie Lou Hamer was more typical. the movement does force the federal government to come in and take action, coercive action, to protect the rights of blacks to at least enjoy public accommodation. So that has a huge impact, especially in education. I didn't mention it, but the federal government also intervenes in University of Alabama, University of Georgia, places like that, to force these schools to admit black students. James Meredith was the first black to attend Alabama, I believe. Charlene Hunter Galt, I don't know if you ever used to watch PBS, she used to be on PBS, first black student to attend the University of Georgia. It took the coercive power of the state to get these students, into these schools. It also took court cases. The Thurgood Marshall Law School at Texas Southern was essentially created because UT and other law schools wouldn't allow blacks in, right? So, like I said, I've spent a lot of time, probably more than I will on any other particular incident or event or area, because it's so important. All right, any questions? All right, take a brief break and then we'll come back and I'll give you your scores, your test.